Hello! In this video we are going to continue our journey with Ansible. Before diving into Ansible architecture and hands-on examples, I want to talk a little bit about overall workflow or logic of Ansible. At first, let's go through a workflow for regular servers. As I've mentioned before, there is a difference between servers and network devices, but it's simpler to start with servers. Let's take a look at an example. We have our Ansible control machine, our automation tool, and we have a VM which runs some flavor of Linux, for example Debian. And we have a task which we want to accomplish and which we want to automate. For example, we want to configure our VM with a DNS server, and we want to automate this task for the future. But when we have 10 more VMs, we want to configure all that VMs with the DNS using automation tool. So, first step is to define what we want to automate. In our case, again, we want to configure a VM with a DNS server. Next step, we need to develop appropriate instructions for Ansible. It means that we need to write so-called playbook. What is a playbook? We will talk in following videos. And finally, we need to execute this playbook. All these three steps we human do. Then Ansible kicks in and Ansible converts our playbook into a single script or series of scripts. In most cases it will be Python, but technically it could be other languages as well. For example, Bash or Ruby, whatever. Then Ansible will upload the script or scripts to our target host. Again, it is a VM in our example, using SSH. So here happens some networking stuff. All previous steps will execute it here or in our head if we're talking about defining our tasks. So Ansible will establish SSH connection, and over that SSH connection it will upload scripts. Then it will execute the script or scripts on target host. And finally, Ansible will clean up all the rubbish, scripts which it has uploaded, and possibly other Ansible related files. Please do not be afraid, Ansible will not delete your data. Now let's discuss other Ansible details. Oh, sorry. These 4 steps Ansible does. Now let's discuss other Ansible details. Obviously, you must install Ansible somewhere, and it will be your Ansible control machine. In this course, I'm not going to show you installation process because it differs from distro to distro. And if you ever installed anything on Linux, you know that it can be pretty tricky. So you may need to spend some time to install it, but it isn't terribly difficult. I believe you can accomplish this task without my help. You can install Ansible on all major Linux distros and macOS as well. Windows does not support Ansible control machine natively, but there are some workarounds which you may use. One more note about Windows. You can't install control machine natively, but you can control Windows hosts using Ansible. So, to be 100% clear, if you have a Windows server, for example, domain controller, which runs Active Directory roles, and you have Ansible control machine, Linux or macOS, doesn't matter. You can control your Windows server with your Ansible control machine. In case of Windows, Ansible will not use SSH, it will use WinRM. It stands for Windows Remote Management, I believe. Next, I want to denote that you don't have to install Ansible Control Machine on a powerful and highly available server. You can use your laptop or PC just fine in most cases. From networking point of view, Ansible Control Machine is actually a client, and target hosts are servers, since you connect to them over SSH. Forget about Windows, it is an exception. Let's imagine that we have Ansible Control Machine, and we control Cisco Ios router. It will be running SSH server, and Ansible Control Machine obviously will be SSH client. This info is pretty self-explanatory, I think, but just to be 100% clear. Next, all logic of your automation resides inside Playbooks, which use YAML structure, Ansible specific syntax, and possibly some Jinja 2 code. We will go through all that stuff in the following videos. YAML structure, Ansible syntax, Jinja 2 code, and many more. And finally, Ansible by default tries to gather facts about system it configures. Linux distribution, network interface information, platform architecture, and many more. So, if we are configuring some Linux flavor, for example Debian, with Ansible, Ansible at first will establish SSH connection, and secondly it will try to gather facts. It will ask target machine following questions. Who you are, what operating system do you run, what network interfaces do you have, what architecture do you have, and many more. It will gather, Ansible will gather all that information, and you will be able to use that information. If we want to configure Cisco Ios, this fact is really important, since in case of iOS we can't do native facts gathering, and we will have to disable that functionality to deal with Cisco Ios devices, for example. Now, with all that information in mind, let's imagine that we want to configure Cisco Ios router instead of a Linux VM. At first, let's talk a little bit about network devices. Yeah, we do have new devices, new models, which support Python. They do have various APIs to interact with. We can't install additional software on them, but I believe that we all know that we still have a huge amount of network devices which support only SSH. So we need some way to interact with them and automate their configuration. And Ansible helps us with that task. First obstacle to face is the fact that we cannot upload a Python script and execute it on such devices. Uploading is technically possible, but executing is not. So, if we have our iOS box, yeah, we can upload a Python script on it, but we cannot execute it. So basically it's pointless. Next, we cannot use any well-known Linux commands such as cat, ls, ifconfig, rm, etc. Cisco Ios is not a Linux distro, and we can't use any common tools we have in Linux. That is why common Ansible approach doesn't work and we need something else. Answer is pretty simple. Use CLI commands. So we will provide essentially the same commands which we use when we configure iOS device manually. So what do you do if you want to configure iOS box, iOS router manually? You establish SSH session and execute CLI commands. conf t, interface Ethernet 0, description X, IP address Y, no shutdown. In case of Ansible, we replace ourselves with an Ansible playbook. Then we will execute this playbook and Ansible will convert this playbook into the same CLI commands, send them over SSH, and basically from router's point of view it is just the same. Router doesn't know if you configure it or Ansible configure it. It's basically the same. But this approach has one drawback. It breaks Ansible's declarative architecture. Declarative means that you don't tell a system what exactly to do, which commands to type, which keys to use, etc. You just provide some pretty broad statement. Install Apache, for example, and Ansible will translate it to low-level commands itself. But in case with Cisco Ios, it's not the truth. So, if we have a Linux VM and we have our Ansible control machine and we want to install Apache, we will put something like this. Just install Apache. We will not give Ansible details. We will not put yum install Apache or apt-get install Apache. Since Ansible can do it itself, it can figure out what tool to use to install Apache. And this method is declarative. We have pretty broad statement and Ansible will convert it into low-level commands. And as I've mentioned before, we cannot use declarative method with Cisco Ios. We need to be very, very specific. We need to know all commands which we need to execute to accomplish some task. It could sound bad, but in the end of the day, Ansible accomplishes tasks which we want it to. So now we have enough information to go further and explore Ansible architecture. Let's take a little break here and I will see you in the next video. Bye bye!